Good morning and welcome to today's program brought to you by the U.S. Botanic Garden. My name is Grace Anderson. I'm the Science Education Specialist at the Garden, and we are so happy to have you joining us for To Know Our Trees, a vital responsibility for today and the future with Dr. W. John Kress. Dr. W. John Kress is a distinguished scientist and Curator Emeritus at Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History and former interim Undersecretary for Science at the Smithsonian Institution. Dr. Kress received his education at Harvard University and Duke University, where he studied tropical biology, ethnobotany, evolution, and ecology. He is a taxonomic specialist on the tropical Zingiberales, which includes heliconia, ginger, and banana. In fact, some of the plants Dr. Kress has collected during his career are now a part of the collections at the U.S. Botanic Garden. His books include Plant Conservation, A Natural History Approach, The Ornaments of Life, Coevolution and Conservation in the Tropics, and most recently, and the topic of today's lecture, Smithsonian Trees of North America. Welcome, Dr. Kress.
Grace, thank you so much, and thanks to the U.S. Botanic Garden for hosting this talk today. I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody that's out there, even though I can't really see you. I wish we could all be in the same room together and look in each other's eyes and talk about trees, but we'll just have to do it on screen. I am going to start by sharing my screen and launch right into a presentation that has a lot of graphic elements to it. So let's see if I can do this correctly. There we go. And let's start right there. Okay, we're going to, as a topic, as Grace mentioned, to know our trees, a vital responsibility for today and the future. And I'm going to talk about all of those things. First, what are trees and what do we know about them, particularly in North America, and then what's happening to trees in North America and other places around the world. So as Grace mentioned, I am primarily and spent my entire career at the National Museum of Natural History as a tropical botanist and spent time traveling around the world, collecting and describing plants and studying the evolution, particularly of plant-animal interactions. And here I'm in the Amazon with one of my favorite plants, something called Phenacospermum, which I believe you have a collection of at the U.S. Botanic Garden. Anyway, that's how I spent a lot of my time. And this is a cloud forest in Ecuador. And I was able to actually describe and spend a lot of time studying as I said, the interactions between plants and animals, particularly plants in this group called Zingiberales, including heliconias and gingers and bananas, but all the different animals that pollinated their flowers. And here you can see hummingbirds, bats, bees, flies, beetles, lemurs. I even spent some time in Madagascar studying lemur pollination there, which was a very unique thing. So that's what occupied me for over 35 years at the Smithsonian. So why did I just write a book on the trees of North America, a tropical botanist like myself? Well, a number of reasons. One of those, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, I must admit I got a little discouraged walking down Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C., or actually walking anywhere, and seeing a lot of younger people, particularly walking down the avenue, not looking around them at all, but looking at their mobile phones. And I was thinking, look at all these trees, look at the trees on the mall, look at nature, and everybody's looking at their cell phone. So together with some computer scientists at University of Maryland and Columbia University, I put together a little iPhone app called LeafSnap, and I'm show it here up on the side. And LeafSnap was designed to have people look at their mobile phones, but also look at nature around them, in particular trees. And we used what was then image recognition technology to develop this app where you could simply take a picture of the leaf of a tree that you were looking at, and it would automatically identify that tree and then link you to all this information about whatever the tree you were looking at, where it was from, whether it was native, whether it was exotic, what the flowers looked like. And believe it or not, it worked. People, a lot of people, not everybody by any means, stopped looking at their iPhones and started looking at the trees around them. In fact, it was so successful in the first 3 years, over 1 million people had downloaded LeafSnap, and we were getting identifications all over the world. So I started my interest in trees back then with this little app called LeafSnap. Unfortunately, LeafSnap, like many apps, is no longer available. But there are other apps that help you identify things. So it was the beginning of such cell phone-based taxonomy, if you want to put it. The other reason I got interested in trees is on the other side of the screen. And this is called, and it says they're DNA barcodes. And some of you may know what a DNA barcode is. Back when we started developing this around 2004, 2005, took 10 years to actually get it going, was we realized that all species on the planet, whether plants or animals, actually had unique little sequences of DNA in their genomes that were unique to the species to which they belonged. And so we could identify a species by taking a small tissue sample of that species and sequencing it and then matching it up to a library of DNA barcodes that we had that we were developing for species on the planet. And we started with trees because, again, I was interested in people looking up, and trees are very conspicuous. So we developed a DNA barcode library of trees, and this has gone on today. And actually, the Smithsonian still has a very big project looking at plots of trees around the world and sequencing the DNA that allows us to identify them from any part, from a bark, from a leaf, from a root, from a flower. So we can now pick up a leaf, an old leaf even, on the forest floor and identify what species that belongs to, even if we can't tell it from the shape of its leaves. So those were two things that got me going on trees. And lo and behold, just this past year in September, which we celebrated at the Natural History Museum, was the publication of Smithsonian Trees of North America by Yale University Press. And this will be kind of the topic. I'm going to go through a number of things I covered in this book, which addresses not really the identification of trees. So it's not a field guide per se. In fact, it weighs 6.5 pounds. So you're not going to carry it with you in Rock Creek Park or any place. But it's really to develop an appreciation of trees. And by appreciating the trees, we begin to appreciate nature more, which we really need to do today. So let's put trees into perspective of the planet. And I like to put this timeline up here. And this is really the history of our planet. If you start at the very top, you see that the Earth itself originated about 4.6 billion years ago. That's billion years ago. It took almost 1 billion years before life appeared on the planet, 3.8 billion years ago. And it took another 3 billion years before life crawled out of the sea. Most early life began in aquatic environments, in seas and other places, and marine environments. But about 500 million years ago, life finally came out of the seas and crawled on to terrestrial habitats. And about 50 million years later, after long periods of adaptation and evolution, plants evolved onto land, and the first trees appeared about 300 million years ago. So starting 4.6 billion years ago, it took us all this time for trees to get going on the planet about 300 million years ago. Then things a little bit more recently happened. 300,000 years ago, humans appeared on the planet. They evolved. So not really that long ago when you compare the entire age of the planet. And a very important event for both humans and the planet was the origination of agriculture 10 to 12,000 years ago. And this completely changed how humans lived, how they congregated in societies and cities and countries. That only happened 10 to 12,000 years ago. And then another big event, as I'm sure all you are aware, is the use of fossil fuels only 250 years ago. So here we go from 4.6 billion years for the origin of the planet up to a major innovation, the use of fossil fuels, only 250 years ago. So keep this little perspective in mind as we start going through the presentation here. So what do we have today? Well, you might see a tree or two down there in New York City, but we've had a lot of impact. When I say we, I mean people, humans that evolved 300,000 years ago. What is happening now to nature and the planet in this age of humans? There's 8 things that come to mind to me immediately, and I'm sure many of you are aware of these. First of all, the degradation and destruction of natural habitats. Secondly, pollution of the air, land, and sea by a lot of things from plastic to carbon dioxide, we'll talk about in a minute. Exploitation of species, whether they're medicinal plants or timber trees or whatever, or food plants. Spread of invasive species. With the evolution and the use of fossil fuels, people started moving around the world a lot, and they were able to then spread species into different continents that they didn't exist in before. This also is true of diseases. So spread of disease is a 5th thing that has been happening. Urbanization, as this photograph of New York City illustrates. And a big one, which actually could be at the top of the list, is climate change caused by this excessive use of fossil fuel. And this impact has really only been happening over the last 50 to 100 years. And then finally, I also want to add, because of what's going on in today's world, that conflict and war, and we see this going on all over the place in Africa and the Ukraine and Gaza. We see that conflict and war is having a major impact on the natural world. We don't often think of that. We don't often see it on the news, but that is a big factor. So why are these having impact? Well, or how did these come about? I think 3 simple causes are, first of all, there are too many people on the planet. There are not enough resources to keep that population moving forward in a rational way. And there's also vast inequality in the distribution of those resources among the different people of the planet. And those 3 reasons, and a lot of reasons, and a lot of other things that come into play with these, are, I think, one of the causes of how nature is being impacted by people. So my travels around the world, particularly in the tropics, here's a tropical forest in the Amazon. And this is what I've seen time and time and time again. Wherever I go, there's no place in the world that I've been where I haven't seen this, in that forests are being degraded, natural habitats are being degraded, the resources are being overexploited. And today, scientists estimate that about 1 million species of what we think are about 10 million species on the planet in the year 2024, 1 million of those 10 million species are now at risk of extinction because of the activities of humans. Okay, so that gives you kind of the background on why knowing about trees and learning about trees and thinking about trees is essential in today's world for all of us. So I'm going to divide this talk into 3 sections. One on, it's called the essence of trees, just to give you some background on how trees are put together. Then I'm going to go into the diversity of trees to give you some idea, primarily of the diversity of trees in North America, but even a kind of a broader scope of how diverse trees are on the planet. And then finally, in the last few minutes of this presentation, before we get into perhaps some questions, the future of trees. What does everything I just outlined in terms of our impact on the planet have to do with the future of trees? So let's start with the essence of trees. And I want to begin in this section on essence by talking about the value of trees. And there's a number of ways we can look at and think about the value of trees. And the first one I want to bring up is the aesthetic and cultural value. We can never forget this. In fact, the U.S. Botanic Garden is there on the mall in large part because of the aesthetic value of plants. And that's what brings everybody into the conservatories there and brings into the gardens outside. Here's a painting by Paul Jones, an Australian contemporary artist, on Magnolia grandiflora, a tree that doesn't even grow in Australia, but he saw the beauty in this tree and the aesthetic value of this tree and painted it. Trees are also essential in poetry, are essential in writing, all kinds of aesthetic pursuits that humans have been involved in or continue to be involved in center around or focus on trees in some way. And here's gardens and arboreta. And this is the Arnold Arboretum up in Boston, Massachusetts, part of Harvard University. An arboreta and botanic gardens have attracted people and have been built for the aesthetic value of the trees that grow there. And whether it's in the fall, as you can see up in the left, or even in the winter, the trees there provide a atmosphere that celebrates nature and provides great value to our everyday lives. And that's not only true in arboreta and botanic gardens, it's true in many of our cities. Here's Tallahassee, Florida, with the avenues and boulevards lined by these beautiful live oaks with Spanish moss hanging from them. They provide a great scene for appreciating nature, even though they're in an urban environment. And the trees of Tallahassee and many other cities, whether it's Washington, D.C. or San Francisco, or even there are places in New York with a lot of trees. It's very important to enriching the lives of people. But these trees, in addition, particularly in cities, of having this aesthetic value and this beauty, also are functionally and have an economic value and environmental value for those living in trees. And I've listed a few of those values in terms of including absorbing nutrients that are flowing up and down our streets all the time, reducing heat. It's clearly been shown that temperatures are lower in cities and in urban environments that have trees than those parts of the cities that don't have trees. They control erosion, they moderate pollution, they provide habitat for other wildlife, whether it's birds or insects or mammals. The trees are there and are providing a lot of benefits. And they also convert carbon dioxide and pull it out of the atmosphere. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. In fact, trees have become such, or have been recognized to have such economic value. Many cities put a dollar value on the trees on their streets. And that value, depending upon the city or town or village, can range from $50 to over $400 to $500 per tree because of all these services that the trees provide to the people living in the cities. In fact, Davy trees, some of you may know Davy, they are great maintainers of trees in urban and rural environments. They've developed an app, not quite LeafSnap, called iTree, and within iTree is an app called MyTree, where you can calculate the dollar value of that tree in your front yard or on the corner of your block. So they recognize that the economic value of trees is very important. Just to recap, in the 19th century, when actually the 18th century, 19th century, when there was a lot of interaction between Europe and North America, these wooden sailing ships were extremely important for fostering the economic growth of North America. One sailing ship, as you can see here, a replica, required 6,000 trees to build. And so the economic value of those trees was extremely important. In fact, by the middle of the 1800s, 75% of the forests in New England had been cut down for either fuel or for the use in tree building and other things. So trees are important for construction, medicines, landscape, ornamental uses, fuel, human food, and household goods. And you can still walk into any store, department store, furniture store, and see a lot of things built of wood. So the economic value is great. And here's a sawmill a few miles from the house where I live in Vermont, where the trees are still being cut down and used for all these purposes. Okay, so the aesthetic value of trees, the economic value of trees, the environmental value of trees, just in the forest where we see trees, again, going out to Rock Creek Park or out along the Potomac there in Washington, trees are helping those forests exist and maintain healthy environments for all the organisms that are there. Just like in cities, they are involved in water and nutrient cycling. They determine the distribution and abundance of all the other plants and animals in the forest. They help recovery after disturbance and carbon storage, pulling that CO2 out of the atmosphere, recycling it into sugars, which provides nutrients for plants and other animals, is very important. I want to focus on carbon storage in a minute. And I mentioned climate change is one of the major impacts on the planet. By far, the current best way to get that carbon dioxide that we're putting in the atmosphere through the use of fossil fuels is through trees. Trees pull in carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, making our air cleaner, although there are not enough trees to do that now, and recycling it into useful things. Many people may not understand that in those green trees, they are using air, water, and sunlight to produce all the energy that's available for life on the planet. And I'll talk about that in a minute. I put these two photographs up here because we know now, even though we've been planting plantations of trees for both economic purposes, but also to take carbon out of the atmosphere, the natural regeneration of forests is much, much, much better at pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere than these monocultures of trees. And this is a tropical eucalyptus plantation down on the bottom right. So how we manage these forests and how we manage trees is very important in terms of how efficient they are at pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. All right, let's move on from the value of trees to the evolution of trees. And here I put up two illustrations. In the top left corner is a Carboniferous swamp of trees 300 million years ago, when I mentioned trees first evolved and dominated these swamps. But you look at these trees in that upper left-hand image drawing, and none of these are trees you'll see today. These are not the sort of trees such as conifers and flowering plants. These were all relatives of ferns, which are our earliest trees. And all of the relatives of these trees that are alive today, you find primarily in the understory of the forest, such as small ferns, selaginellas, equisetums, these sorts of things. So they now are no longer arborescent, but have a completely different habitat and habit. You go down to the right. Well, let me first say, after the domination for maybe 100 million years of these types of trees, we then have the evolution of conifers and gymnosperms, completely different, and that led to our current day pines and cypress and such things. And then 65 million years ago, when the dinosaurs demised, there was a major transition of plant life on the planet, and flowering plants began to diversify. And if you look at the eastern deciduous forest that I show in the bottom right corner, almost all of these are angiosperms. We do have gymnosperms and conifers in these forests, but they're primarily made up of angiosperms until you get to the boreal areas. So trees have evolved for about 300 million years, and this is the types of and the habitats we see of trees today. Let's talk a little bit about the diversity and abundance of trees. And we can think about this. Diversity is the various species that inhabit any particular habitat or forest. So we talk about species diversity. And then the number of individuals within a species is what we call density. And so we have tree density as well. And if you look at the bottom left photograph, that's a boreal forest with one species, a species of spruce that is dominant completely. There's a few other species, but it's mostly a very abundant species, and the density is made up of only a few species. Where you go to the tropical forest in the upper right, and the density is very low. You have to walk sometimes a kilometer to find a second individual of the same species. So there's a lot of species, but a very low density. And this trade-off between density and diversity is something we see in habitats all around the world. Right now, we estimate that there are about 400,000 species of plants currently living on the planet today. 400,000. I mentioned there's 10 million species of plants, animals, and fungi on the planet, and 400,000 of those are plants. Of those 400,000 species, 73,000 are species of trees. So less than a quarter of the species on the planet are trees. Those 73,000 species of trees include 3 trillion individual trees. And I won't tell you exactly how we calculated that, but just a few years ago, using satellite imagery and on-the-ground monitoring, we estimated that those 73,000 species are represented by 3 trillion individual trees on the planet. That's a lot of trees, and it's great. There probably were more 100 years ago, and even more than that 1,000 years ago, but right now we have 3 trillion individual trees. Also, a number of years ago, it was the attempt was made to get an estimate of the density of trees. Particularly, this first study was done in the Amazon, where it's estimated that we have about 16,000 of those 73,000 species of trees in the Amazon basin alone. A very large area, but that's a lot of species of trees. An analysis of the abundance of those trees suggests that of those 16,000 species, only 227 species account for 50% of the trees you'll find in the forest there. So most of the trees, the other 15,000 plus species, are extremely rare. Many of these species we haven't even discovered yet because they're all very rare, and only 227 account for, or 1.4% of the species of trees account for 50% of the stems. That's an astounding observation to make in terms of density. I was interested in the same thing in North America, and I realized that there had been no recent studies of the abundance and density, or the diversity and density of trees in North America. We know that there are about 1,700 species of trees in North America, and this is North America north of Mexico, the US and Canada. I didn't want to get into Mexico because it opens up a whole new tropical realm there. But of Canadian and US North America, there are about 1,700 species of trees. I did the same sort of analysis that was done in the Amazon and found out that only 36 of those 1,750 species of trees accounts for 50% of the stems in our forest. And this is across North America. 36 species is not a whole lot, but it's not that different in terms of the percentage of the species that make up the greatest abundance of trees in our forests. I did kind of further analyze this abundance data and found out that in total, 326 species of those 1,750 make up 98% of the stems. So those are the common trees that we see. Very few of you will probably see any of these other of the 1,700 species of trees that aren't these common species because they're relatively rare in North America, or they're cultivated in only a few places. So this does include introduced species as well. And these 326 common species are what I decided to put in this book on the trees of North America, because I wanted the trees that most people would encounter to be covered in an in-depth way in the Smithsonian Trees of North America. Sorry to ramble on so much, but I wanted you to understand about this difference between diversity and abundance. So what is a tree? You don't know how many people ask me, well, what is a tree? And I asked myself that when I started working on trees with leaf snap and DNA barcoding and then this book. Well, what is a tree? So I decided to start by getting some opinions from some other people that I didn't know what they knew about trees. So I asked a 6-year-old girl living in London, of all places, if she could send me a drawing, a painting of what she thought a tree was. And this is exactly what she sent, this 6-year-old. And I was astounded at what she knew about trees in London, of all places. She got it right, a trunk and a crown, and there were leaves in that crown, but there were also blossoms. There were apples, there were fruits in that tree, there were branches, there were roots, all of the things. There was the sun that was helping the tree photosynthesize and live. And there were all the animals that were interacting with the tree that she had observed in London. There were birds and butterflies and other insects. There were worms. Little cat who did this drawing knew a lot about trees. And so I thought, well, I don't even need a definition. I don't need to define trees. at all if I write this book, because people in general, they know what a tree is. But I did put a few definitions, and I just thought I'd read one definition to give you uh, some idea of how people are trying to define what Kat illustrated here. And this is from a book by David Sibley, who's primarily an ornithologist and has written a number of books on birds, very knowledgeable, great books, and also one on the trees of North America. And his definition of a tree was, quote, "A tree is a perennial plant with a single woody stem, at least a few inches thick, at about 4 feet from the ground, branching into a well-formed crown of foliage and reaching a height of at least 12 or 15 or 20 feet." I have to read that because I can't remember that that definition. And then David follows up that definition, understanding that it's something most people wouldn't remember, with this one: particularly distinguishing trees from shrubs. If you can walk under it, it's a tree. If you have to walk around it, it's a shrub. So that's the definition that I'd like all of you to remember when you're trying to figure out, well, what the heck is a tree? Let's turn to the structure of trees a little bit. And I want to just say, when you look at a tree, how do you look at it and how do you assess it and how do you figure out how it's put together? And so starting with the shapes of trees, I've put up 7 different examples, and you can see some of the conifers tend to be conical with a lot of long branches at the bottom and then tapering up to small branches at the top. The branches are clustered in circles, like in the white pine there. You get down to the angiosperms, the flowering plants, and you can see they're rounded trees like the maples. And then there are some trees like the Siberian elm on the right side that have kind of a erratic behavior, more of a random behavior, although it's all very structured, and each tree species ends up with this shape because of how the tree branches, how the leaves are formed on it, and all kinds of things. In fact, a professor of mine at Harvard when I was growing up in botany wrote several books, in which he talked about the architecture of trees. He didn't call it the shapes of trees. He talked about the architecture, because that's exactly what it is, how the branches relate to each other, how they branch as they go out towards the edges, and all that sort of thing. So structure and shape is a very important part of looking at trees when you look at one. Bark that surrounds the trunk and protects the inside of the trunk and the inside of the woody parts is very characteristic for many species. Here I just put up a few examples. You can start over on your left and see American beech with very smooth bark, striped maple with also kind of smooth bark, but furrows going up and down. You get to something like black locust, has these very deep, knobby, vertical bark structure there. The gymnosperms and conifers, the eastern hemlock is one of those, has more of a kind of a patchy sort of bark. And then you get to sycamores, and here's the California sycamore, and you have this very sticky kind of bark with peeling sections that come off very easily, which turns out to have some adaptations to living in cities. And many sycamores are good urban trees. So a lot of different barks, and each of these barks have evolved to protect the inside functioning of the tree, particularly the trunk, in specific ways. So there's some function to all of this, whether it's furrowing water down the trees or protecting it from damage or fire or all kinds of things. Now you go inside that trunk or inside a branch and you find the wood. And I'm sure many of you have looked at different woods, whether it's in your house or apartment or on the street somewhere. And the wood structure, and this is all the vascular system that's inside the trunk that's bringing nutrients and water up the tree and bringing photosynthetic products down the tree, is all these different bark types. And you can see they're different colors, they're different shapes, they're different orientation of the vascular system, all provide that aesthetic value that I was talking about earlier. And I'm building a little cottage here at my house in Vermont, and I've been picking out woods because of the aesthetic values that they will provide to people inside the cottage. Anyway, a lot of different bark, each with different properties. Then we get to the leaves, and this is again what leaf snap was based upon. And you can see there's a lot of different structures of leaves as well, and these are just temperate zone plants, North American plants. Some have simple leaves with a simple blade and a simple petiole. Some are compound leaves in the bottom part of this diagram. You get very complex ones, such as the palm there. And you have to remember that all of these shapes are there again to help the tree function, or to allow the tree, not necessarily help it, but to allow the tree to function in its role of photosynthesis. It's quite amazing to remember that it is simply air, water, and sunlight. That's all that's needed, and a few nutrients here or there, for the trees to photosynthesize in these leaves. And that's what the function of these leaves are. Photosynthesize to produce sugars as nutrients or as energy for the tree to grow and reproduce. And they provide that energy to all other life on planet: air, water, and sunlight. That's all going on in these leaves. Let's finish up here on the structure of trees with first cones. Cones are found in gymnosperms, or what we also sometimes call conifers or conifers. Many people don't even know or are not aware of that there are male and female cones in all conifers. Here you can see male cones on the left side, which produce the pollen. There's a little female cone on the right side with that color. And then there's the mature cone that produces the seeds. But every tree you go out, particularly in the spring, you look at your spruce out here, you'll see, and you shake the branch, you see all the pollen coming out of the male cones. Very important structure. And we go to flowers, you get the same thing. And remember, flowers didn't evolve till about 65 million years ago. Before that, all reproduction in trees was primarily by cones, female and male cones. But then we get this evolution of the flower and these amazingly diverse structures. And as a botanist and other botanists, this is what we spend our lives studying in many cases. Not only the shapes of these flowers and how they're put together so we can identify flowers, but also how they function. And as I mentioned, it's one of the things I did in my career, was look at the interaction between these flowers and the animals that pollinated them. So you have up in the left corner, you have southern magnolia, Magnolia grandiflora, quite common on the streets of Washington, D.C., with these giant tepals or petals and the little sexual parts in the inside. Other angiosperms, like the pawpaw, has smaller flowers, but still with these very conspicuous petals. Then you go down to the bottom left corner, and in some of the birches and related trees, you have extremely small little flowers that are grouped in these catkins. And that's what produces the pollen and also will eventually produce the fruits. And then you go over to the right side, and this is a dogwood. I'm sure many of you recognize dogwood. And everything you see that's really conspicuous isn't a flower at all. It's a modified leaf that leaves that have evolved to look like flowers to attract insects, to the very small flowers in the very center. So all kinds of different structures in flowering plants, all with the sole purpose of producing these. That is, fruits and the seeds contained with them, so the tree is able to reproduce for the next generation. And again, fruits in trees are equally diverse as the flowers, with some fruits that are dried and capsules like the sweet gum in the very center, some legumes, some are very fleshy, like the persimmon, or form drupes like you see in the holly in the bottom corner, are apples. So a lot of different types of fruits have evolved, again, with the sole purpose of allowing the tree to reproduce for the next generation. So all of these structures are things that botanists study and are things that you should appreciate when you look at a tree. Not just the tree, but even the 6-year-old was able to understand that that tree produces flowers and bark and roots and fruits and interacts with animals in the environment where they exist. Okay, we're moving along here. I want to next talk a little bit about the ecology of trees and how all these structures I just described are functioning in trees and natural habitats. And in a very simplistic way, when you look at any tree, whether it's planted on a street or in the Arboretum or in Rock Creek Park or in a forest anywhere, you can really think of it as three different types. One on the left, it can be a native species that has evolved in the habitat where you are. Black locust is one of those, or red maple has evolved in North America. You can also think of a tree, if you walk up to it, as being introduced from another continent, another land. And these are trees that have some aesthetic value or some economic value and were brought from other lands where they evolved into habitats such as North America, where they're only known because they're cultivated, and Norway maple is one of these. And then there are those trees that were brought from other places where they evolved, but have been brought to North America and have learned to adapt to the conditions here and actually have become what we call naturalized, can reproduce in these exotic environments where they find themselves, and in some cases actually become invasive. And they can take over and compete and reproduce, out-reproduce our native species that's pictured on the very left. So any tree you come up to, you can either think of it as native or identified as native, as introduced and cultivated, or as naturalized and possibly invasive. The thing about that last category I just wanted to mention is we think of invasives often in a very negative way, as something that's come and is taking over. But we have to remember that all these invasives were introduced by humans. They didn't necessarily come here on their own by their own reproductive systems. They came here and were introduced. So they are native somewhere. They did have a life, they did evolve somewhere, but now in new habitats here, they've become a little overwhelming. The habitats of trees. I won't spend too much time on this, but just for those of you that may not know North America, we have a lot of different habitat types, starting in the west, on the west coast, coming all the way over to the east coast, where different tree species have evolved, or different tree species can now exist. Starting up in the left corner with the Pacific Northwest forest, which we sometimes call the temperate rainforest, there's a lot of moisture, a lot of fog, and you get large gymnosperms that are covered with uh, lichens and mosses, as you see here. You go actually south of that, way down to Southern California, you find chaparral habitats, which are the opposite. They're very dry. They get rain only at a certain time of the year, and they've evolved a completely different type of tree down there with different adaptations to live in these dry habitats. The Rocky Mountain forests, again, they're dominated at higher elevations by a lot of conifers, have a very different habitat and have very different species complement. And then you get down to the southwest, which are dry forests and desert forests. And again, a different suite of trees that have adapted to the conditions that they experienced there over the last millions of years. Come to the other side of the continent, the eastern deciduous forests, really quite different cohort of tree species. In these forests, you have three distinct seasons. You have the summer in the bottom or the left side, the fall in the center here with a lot of color, particularly here in New England, and then the winter, which we've entered now, and I have snow on the ground here in Vermont, in which all the trees, except for the conifers, or most of the conifers, lose their leaves, and the trees are bare for 5 to 6 months of the year. No leaves. So very different than the West Coast. Go down to the south of the U.S., three primary different types of forests, the oak hickory forest, the great pine barrens of New Jersey and areas where you have a mixture of pine and oak and hickory dominating these forests. You go to the coastal plain forests in the Carolinas. These are forests that have a lot of pines and also some oaks. They are fire adapted. They are naturally adapted to fire sweeping through the forest. In fact, on some of these trees in the center, you can see the charred bark. And so they have cones and bark that are able to withstand these fires, and they're necessary in some cases for the reproduction. And then down in the southern floodplain forest is exactly the opposite. Often along rivers and in swampy areas, the trees are not adapted to fire down there. They're adapted to often standing water, and again, a different cohort of species. So just you can see that a lot of the habitats, and that's why we have such a diverse tree flora in North America with 1,700 species, because we have all these different types of habitats. And there are many more that I didn't mention here. So going on to the second section, and we'll be wrapping this up pretty soon, on the diversity of trees. And here are just 3 species, including an exotic and a couple of native species. The diversity of trees, as I just mentioned, in North America is great. Here are just a quick view of oaks. Oaks are one of the most diverse tree genera in North America. There are 41 species of common oaks that are covered in the book on trees, each with a different type of leaf structure pictured here. Again, to remind you, we estimate there are between 1,400 and 1,700 species total. This is not quite, it's not just one number, because species are being introduced all the time, and some species are actually going extinct as well. But of those 1,700 species, we know that 881 are native. And of those 1,700, as I mentioned earlier, 326 species are common trees. And of those 326, 280 are native trees that have evolved in North America. So the diversity is great. And I wanted to show you a bit of this. I have to mention, I'm sure a lot of you know, and recognize that our friend Charles Darwin, one of the greatest natural history scientists of the 1800s, wrote a book on the origin of species when he described the process of evolution. And if you look in that book, there's only one illustration that Darwin provided, and it's this one here, and it's what he called the tree of life. And Darwin was trying to explain how trees evolved. If you go way down to the bottom of this diagram, for example, look at A, that's a single species evolved. That species then divides, and other species evolve from it, and then diversify, and other species evolve from those, until you get up to time today at the top of this diagram. And that's the diversity of trees we find now. So Darwin was able to use this tree of life and how species evolve to talk about developing a natural classification based upon the evolutionary patterns of trees. And so for this book, I decided what would be the best way to, again, provide a background and more of an evolutionary perspective on the trees that we find in North America. I decided to use that tree of life, which has been updated since Darwin's time. And here is what we call the plant tree of life. And this came out of a group of scientists at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, although it was a global effort to get this tree together. And this is depicting how plant life has evolved over the last 300 million years, or maybe more than that, into those species or in those families and plants that are represented today. And you can divide this tree of plant life into 6 major groups, and I just want to briefly talk about each of those. At the very bottom on the right are the gymnosperms, which have cones. Then the angiosperms that developed flowers 65 million years ago. We start with what we call the primitive type. The magnoliids include our magnolias and avocados on the left. We have something called the early diverging eudicots. You'll never remember that name, but those are just another branch that includes a kind of a consortium of these different types of plants. The monocots, which is what I studied in my career, include palms, gingers, bananas, and in the North America, there's only 2 types of trees, the palms and the yuccas, that are found in the monocots. And then at the very top are the 2 major clusters of flowering plants, the rosids on the left in green. These include the maples and the oaks, and the asterids on the right, which are related to the dogwoods and ashes and a bunch of other things, and I'll show those in a second. So rather than, many field guides will present the trees of North America in terms of their structure, divide the trees into those with opposite leaves versus alternate leaves, compound leaves versus simple leaves, big flowers versus little flowers. I decided to organize the book and present those 326 species in an evolutionary fashion, so people can slowly begin to understand the plant tree of life. So looking at a few of these examples, start with the gymnosperms. Ginkgo. I'm sure many of you know ginkgos. They're quite common, probably extinct in the wild from China, but it is a gymnosperm, not cones, a different type of fruit. But then many pines, and the genus Pinus. The pines are the second largest genus of trees in North America after the oaks. And here you can see the cones on the right side, the male cones and the female cones, the mature cones, the leaves, the bark, the branches. Get into the magnoliids, the avocados. Here's that big Magnolia grandiflora again with those big, large, fragrant, beetle-pollinated flowers. Onto the monocots, as I mentioned, there are palms and oh no, and I didn't put yucca in here, but yuccas are the Joshua tree is another big group or another type of monocot which we find in North America. On to those early diverging eudicots, only 2 in North America, the sycamores, and this is the California sycamore. And then on to the rosids, a very big group, as I said, made up of maples. And here you can see maple flowers, and many of you may not understand that besides those characteristic fruits shown on the bottom that we all recognize as a maple, they also have characteristic flowers, these pendant little clusters of flowers, which in many cases are separate male and female flowers, either on the same tree or on different trees. And here they're pictured so you can begin to understand how these trees actually reproduce. And another relative in the roses is the oaks, as I mentioned. And again, we think of oaks having acorns, but oaks also have flowers. And they have separate male and female flowers. And on those 2 little squares on the right in the middle section, those are the female flowers, which probably most of you have never seen or even heard of. And then the male flowers are those clusters that hang down, and you shake them again, pollen comes out of them, they make you sneeze. And then you sweep them up at the end of the flowering season on the sidewalks and roads where oaks often grow. So something to learn about the flowers there. The last group, the asterids, include the cornus, the dogwoods, and I show them here, and there's the fruits and the flowers and the tiny little flowers and those modified leaves. And then finally, I included one cactus, which is in the asterid, the saguaro cactus from the southwest deserts, and it too, you can walk under it, so it is a tree, and very different type of tree though, but it is in the book as a tree of North America. Okay, I've got a few more minutes left, so I'm going to skip over this. I just wanted to mention about the photos in the book. I'm responsible for all the photos in the book. I took the majority of them. Many I had to go to great lengths to get living material to take a photograph. Some I could not find living. All of these photos that you see here were taken from herbarium sheets. These are old, dried specimens that are used by scientists to understand the diversity of trees in North America, but they also have beautiful little plant parts. Some of these are over 100 years old, but they tell us about the structure of trees, so I included them in the book. The future of trees? Well, as I showed you when I started, what I'd experienced in the tropics, trying to understand how plants have evolved with many degraded habitats, many trees being cut down. That's not just something that's going on far away from us in the tropical parts of the world. This is what's happening actually in my backyard in Vermont, in New England. We are using the trees, rightfully so, to all those economic and values that we have for trees, but we have to make sure that we're doing this in a very sustained way and in a very thoughtful manner. Otherwise, the degradation of these habitats is going to happen before we know it. The same things that are happening that I mentioned that are happening that humans have caused with an impact on habitats in general are happening to trees. And here are the 8 things I listed earlier, from degradation all the way to climate change and conflict and war. We have now tried to address these problems by developing methods of assessing the conservation status of trees. And the IUCN, maybe some of you know these categories from critically endangered all the way to least concerned. Every tree in the book that I put together has their conservation assessment included, so you can find out what the status of these trees in terms of the impact of humans on these trees. And then climate change has also had an impact. And the U.S. Forest Service has now devised a similar way of assessing the impact of climate change on the vulnerability of each species. And this is also included in the book for each species of tree in North America. Now, there's a lot that we can do to try to decrease this degradation and decrease these impacts that humans have on natural environments. And I just put a few here. Some could be at the international level, like this Convention on Biological Diversity a meeting that happened in Colombia a month ago. Regional environmental groups like wildlands, woodlands, and farmlands. There's Vermont Biodiversity Alliance, which is focused primarily on the conservation of Vermont. And there are even local groups such as the Friends of the Mad River that are doing this. All of these are ways that each of us can act as we understand the vulnerability of trees to today's environmental conditions, how we can act to help them. A lot of thanks to many people here, and I won't go over all of these, but I appreciate it, particularly at the Smithsonian Institution and at Yale University Press. So I'm going to end there. I'm going to stop sharing the screen and see if there are any questions or any comments that people would like to make about this. Sorry for rambling on for so long, but it's a long book. It's 788 pages, so there's a lot to read about and a lot for me to describe. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kress. We learned so much about trees. I know I'm definitely going to take a walk after this and look more closely at the trees in my neighborhood. And we've got some great questions coming through in the chat. We've got a couple of minutes, so we'll try to tackle as many questions as we can. One person is looking for a recommendation on resources around animal-plant interactions in North America. Do any things come to mind about how folks can learn more about trees and their ecosystems?
That's a really good point. In terms of plant-animal interactions, there's no one source of that, because when you look at a tree, there are pollinators of the flowers, there are dispersers of the fruits and seeds, there are the insects that are actually attacking the tree that the tree has to fend off. There are larvae of butterflies and moths that are specific on trees that live on their leaves so they can reproduce themselves. It doesn't necessarily harm the tree, but there's all these interactions. There's no single compendium that I know of that has this. I tried to summarize that information for each of those 326 species so you can find out what butterflies feed on this tree and that tree. But that's whoever wants to put that together, I'd be happy to help.
Excellent. So we've got some questions coming through about tulip poplars and how did they get that name? Folks are saying it sounds like it's a misnomer.
Well, tulip poplars have flowers that's on the cover of the book, the back cover, that look like tulips. It's a Magnoliaceae. It's like related to those Magnolia grandiflora, the southern magnolia that I showed. And so when you see this tree in the spring when it's flowering, it looks like at the tip of every branch is a tulip. Now, how the poplar part got in there, I don't know. I guess the bark is a little poplarish, but they certainly look like tulips. In fact, on the campus when I was an undergraduate, I saw this tree I never recognized that had all these tulips at the end of the branches because it was a rare tree in New England, and it was a tulip poplar, Liriodendron tulipifera. So even Linnaeus understood that it had tulips on it. Good question.
Thank you. It's one of my favorite trees. If folks are in DC, I think you can see a lot of them in Rock Creek Park if you're lucky enough. Yeah. For our last question here, we have someone who, when they visit their local botanic garden or parks, they're concerned because they see lots of landscape fabric, wire wrapped around the trunks of the trees. And when they go to their local nursery, they see a lot of cultivars, and some of them are not in great shape. And so they're wondering, how can we plant trees and take care of trees properly? How can we take care of the trees in our landscapes? Any recommendations about that?
Number one, pay attention to them. Look at them. Look at your trees. If you've got trees in your yard or if you've got trees in a trail you walk in Rock Creek Park, look at them and see if there's anything you can tell that's happening to them. Are there insects biting them? Are the deer browsing on the bark, which could eventually cause the tree to demise? So first of all, pay attention to them. Second of all, you can protect particularly the trees in your own that you can act on with things like you just mentioned, with some wraps that can go around the bark, with some sort of screening that keep on my apple trees here. I planted them, but I don't like the idea that the deer are eating all the apples or that are chewing on the bark. So I protect them, and the trees can thrive in that way. But mostly I think it's getting to know your trees and finding out what's natural and what's not natural. Not every butterfly larvae on a tree, on an oak particularly, is detrimental to that oak. So we need to begin to learn more and learn what we can do and what we can't do. That's kind of a simplistic answer, but that's what I'd say in the 1 minute I had.
I love it. Get to know your trees. That's an excellent way to end this presentation. Dr. Kress, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. And thank you everyone for attending.
Clearly my pleasure. Thank you, Grace.
I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their weekend. To learn more about future programs, please visit usbg.gov/programs. One more note is that this will be recorded and put on our website for future viewing. And we hope everyone enjoyed the presentation today and has a wonderful weekend. Thank you again, Dr. Kress.
So long.